bit of context, my name is Mason. I'm actually based out of Atlanta. I'm really excited to be here today. And I want to find out where I can get one of these sweatshirts. So just send me the link and I'll sign up and give you my credit card, just take my money and be happy to rock one. I've been working in the agency space for almost 20 years. I started Edgar Allan 10 years ago. It'll be 10 years ago in April. And we are kind of like a brand to build agency. We've focused on Webflow for the past 8 years, and we've broken Webflow about every which way you can. Early days, I submitted a lot of tickets, and I think they were directly going to Bryant and Vlad. And so, we've definitely gone back and forth on a whole bunch of stuff. And I've seen a lot of things in terms of how the platform has evolved. And I think for today, the conversation is really this idea of, it's like knowing your edge, and this bigger topic for what I'd say is like knowing yourself, which is not a new idea. So Socrates talked about this, know thyself. Hopefully today's conversation goes better than it did for Socrates. Socrates was later poisoned for asking a bunch of questions. But, for today's conversation, I just wanted to be able to say that no code really, for me, is a starting place, and it's a place to start to know how to code and really what is programming. And this whole conversation actually came up through a survey that you sent out, Rachael. And I was like, my answers were something along those lines of, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I feel like the future of no code is really actually with lots of code, and that there's opportunities for Neil, like you, to be able to have a big contribution within a project. And we can start to think about Webflow not as a thing that has to be pure in terms of like who can work within it, but really as more of a watering hole, so that a lot of people can come around with their strengths and bring whatever strengths they might have. If they're a visual designer, I don't know if that's redundant, but if you're a designer, that you can kind of work declaratively and start to create pages, in a Webflow-like environment. If you come from more of a coded background, then you can start to think about how to extend, what you're doing and working within Webflow. If you're a writer, thinking about how to write within Webflow, and really just looking at this common place where we can all come together and start to work in a really unique way. And so I've seen this kind of come about in a few ways, and for us as an agency, we call it this idea of what I'd say is like Webflow plus. So the other thing, it's like the idea of no code has always kind of bothered me because it starts with a negative. And I think for me, I generally try to think about like, what is it that we can add to something as opposed to what is it that we can subtract for something. So
Mason, can I pause you for a second?
Yeah.
Should we be seeing something?
Not yet. I actually don't have like a big presentation, so I'll just, razzle dazzle hands here.
Okay, perfect. And then the other thing I'd say is we might record this. So if anyone doesn't want to be on camera, you can turn off your cameras now so that you don't end up on YouTube or whatever. So just a warning. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Okay, cool. All right. Are we recording, or you have to like?
No, we're good.
Okay, cool. What I was going to do is first I'll open up and see like, are there general questions that anyone has just on that sort of topic? Anything that, people want to throw out, things for me to look at. Otherwise, I was going to go in and jump into a project where we start to blend these worlds, and then start to talk about some stuff that I've been looking at.
Maybe you'll talk about this, but I think an interesting thing for us to eventually touch on and whatnot is, one of the, I don't know if it's a challenge, but one of the complexities of developing everything like just full on with code is the maintainability of that. You need to have someone who's very specialized in that language or that product, or, and I'd be curious, as you're talking about this like marriage of code and no code, to hear your thoughts, and maybe it makes sense while you're showing, but like the maintainability of something when you're doing it in code and no code, and how do you continue to evolve products and improve them and maintain. So anyway, that's my only kind of question right now. But
Cool. Yeah, and I think it really starts to get into the complexity. And for the work that we do, we're just sort of this blend of just like pure Webflow brochure sites to kind of this hybrid of like a low code type of product where we're using Webflow as like the presentation layer and then starting to use like just a little bit of JavaScript to extend that. And then where we're getting into something like Letter Run, which is like actually using a lot of JavaScript and like the Webflow for content and UI elements and things along those lines, and then just into pure application development. So looking at that sort of like continuum of project types, I think that a mistake that can be made is always like, no matter what the project type, trying to kind of cram it through that first, Webflow only or sort of no code only. I feel like by the time you get into, like getting into Integromat, or I guess it's called Make now, and Zapier and like things along those lines, that it actually becomes harder to maintain and becomes more fragile with the more no code tools that you start to use. And Kyle, I know we talked about this, even before this. And it's almost like it's fine to just get it going, but then there becomes a point where it's moving from, like visual programming or kind of more like declarative layouts, where I'll just say it's declarative layouts because you're going like hero section, left, right, nav bar, like it's more around authoring. And that's really what we try to do, is that when in our work we're thinking about not what can we like not write code for, but how can we go and empower authoring for our customers. So really using authoring as that primary goal, and then everything else is in sort of support of that authoring goal. And that if we try to get too much into those like that, I think trying to do conditional logic visually becomes very problematic. And I also feel like where the world is going, the idea of visually programming is going to be obsolete within 3 years. And I would say that, I don't know, like hot take here, but let me go in and screen share. So, and this is what I'm talking about. So I know everyone is like super hyped on Chat GTP. I actually asked, is Die Hard a Christmas film? And it gave me a nice political answer here. But if I was to think about what's the future of programming, or like what's the future of no code, I believe it's more like this: write a JavaScript function to create a random number. And that this is what, I'm not going to be sitting here and pulling out blocks. And again, like we're already doing this. So I think it's like mass adoption here within 3 to 5 years. And if you look at like how difficult it is to try to do this visually, I mean, like Webflow announced Logic a year and a half ago at the last Webflow conference, and it's still not fully out, or it's like kind of, it's out in a very limited fashion. So if you look at the rate in which the technology is going to be evolving, a better bet on your career, I believe, is to learn what it means to program, but you're actually not going to have to write code. So all this is meaning is like, I'm going to go and copy and paste this in here. And then when I want to declare it inside of Webflow, I'm just going to go like get random number. I'm just going to go and like know that I just need to throw this in there. And I think that's when, when I'm saying like we need to go in here, no, stop sharing, really need to think about like, what does it mean to have these swim lanes? A lot of the stuff that's going to be happening, it's going to start to change really fast. And it's trying to think about like, not where, it's like the Wayne Gretzky thing of like, don't skate to the puck, skate to the puck where the puck is going. I think I said that right. I'm not like big into hockey, or like I played the hockey.
Yeah, it was right. It was right.
Okay. And so I think what I'm trying to think about and sort of look for us as a team is like, what's the fewest, the other part that I would say is, as it relates to maintainability, is what happens when one of these tools goes away, or what happens when there's an update or things along those lines, because we've seen that happen definitely with Zapier. Like they'll change something, it happens just enough, and then all of a sudden, like you're trying to go in and understand like what broke in this very sort of abstract, like kind of kludgy in terms of documentation, like you're getting into a programming environment no matter which way. Now, if you feel more comfortable with visually programming, that's great. I just think that, in the very near future, you're going to have two views. You're going to have like speech view and you're going to have code view, which is also weird because like code view is really just going to be like speech view is just going to be like writing in prompts that are then going to be creating like the JavaScript. But before I go into future world too much, right? And so before I start, going down like this chat GDP thing, let me back up and let me talk about a sample project here that starts to bring these worlds together. And then from there, we can dive into it more. So I believe, so I've, talked a bit about letter run. And this is the, kind of combination of 3JS and Webflow. We're using Webflow for all the user interface, as well as for how we're triggering out animations, all the content. So it's actually driven by the CMS, and then all these like little micro animations, things along those lines, those are all done within Webflow. And then if I wanted to be able to see sort of like our drawer here, I can go in and like read the about. All of this is Webflow, and it allowed us to actually like prototype this really quickly. But then, the part that's not Webflow is like basically, this little guy running around. And so we have lots of JavaScript that's like driving all of this.
So if I looked at the Webflow project of letter run, it would look, what would it look like? Would it look like a normal Webflow project, or what is it?
Yeah, kind of like, so we have all the assets are in Webflow. And so we have the loader, we have, all these UI elements. All of these elements are kind of here within Webflow. And then the part that's outside of Webflow is this 3JS instance that's running inside of here. And what we did was we then had to figure out, what is the workflow for all this start to look like? So I'm going to close this down and go into how we originally approached this, which was this workflow here. And I lost my mouse, trying to move this guy over so I can actually see myself. And so this is also the workflow so it's like work in Webflow and then export out to React, and then React consumes 3JS. This is also the workflow for DevLink, and a couple other points that I would make as it relates to thinking about Webflow specifically bigger than no code. I believe that Webflow is even thinking this, so I won't make Corey like say any he's not going to spill any beans here. But if you noticed, it was no longer the no code conference that we went to. It was the Webflow conference. And within the Webflow conference, there was actually the thing that everyone was really excited about was a coded piece, DevLink. So how to work within Webflow and then export that out into React. So this was our first pass, and we learned a lot within this. The challenge that we ran into, because we were not working with DevLink, is that all of a sudden we could not have the same workflow. And so we would go in, work in Webflow, export this, and then there was like a hard line for how we could go in and start to make updates. And that was really bad. So we couldn't just, everything started to become just a coded application that sort of had the facade of working within Webflow. So what we did was we basically ripped out about half of the project and started it over. And we found it was actually easier to initialize a React application inside of Webflow and then set what's called event listeners on the UI elements. So within Webflow, if you're looking at the code there, all the code is create new instance of letter run, add listener for all the different UI elements that you see on the screen. And then we then delegate the events from the application back into Webflow so that you can then go and so if something happens, we can have the nav open up, or if we're finding something, we can say hey, go in and add one more item to the menu. And so it's only about 9 lines of code that you see within Webflow, but then everything else is a very rich coded application. And this allowed us to then have, designers working from Figma into Webflow. And then, from a React standpoint, we're just, again, we're creating this new object. This is our nudge object. And then we're adding those listeners and then those delegators. This is kind of getting into that a little bit more, but what that allowed for is just these really clear swim lanes where, you could be just technical enough where if you could write, just the listener and the delegator, then you just knew kind of where to wire those two things up. And then otherwise you're just working in Webflow. You're just like, visually tweaking everything, adding all of the sort of like the side nav, getting the different kind of like pop-ups to work, the menu, like all of that sort of stuff. And then for our React developer, they could just work in a text editor and they could just compile that and work in a totally separate environment, have this going up to GitHub, like all of this sort of stuff. And then when these two worlds come together, that's where it became really powerful. And, there is a very clear, like, okay, I need a new function that I'm going to be firing from, that I'm going to delegate to this piece here. Now, that if you're new to programming, these ideas may sound complicated, and and abstractly they can be. But what I've found is that if there's about, I think the real, I think, power that no code allows for, again, is it allows for us to know how to code. And so a lot of the stuff that, the more that you get into Webflow, the more that you're starting to learn about concepts like abstraction and like how to go and have like really clear sort of like namespace. And like, that's a lot of what, these visual frameworks like, like Knockout or Client First or the system, or all, those are all starting to get into just like foundations of, naming and abstraction and models for how to effectively code. We're just having to do it visually. So what we're seeing is, hey, let's, world, no code world, start to think a couple steps ahead. And I think if you just understand, like, what is a variable, what is an array, what is like a function, what is an object, it's a list of a half a dozen elements. And then at that point, then we can go in and say, all right, for the really complicated stuff, I'm just going to, I can go over here and say, like, write a base 3 JS application. And it will just go and write this. So all this stuff that, that we really like, it took us a while to be able to figure out. Now that's just going to happen in the background. So that's where I think this stuff starts to get really interesting, is for the really hard elements, just understanding kind of what's happening. And then from there, so here we're, instantiating a new scene, new 3.scene, like all this stuff. And then from there saying like, okay, what's the 5 lines of code that I need to be able to do to instantiate this into my Webflow application?
So just so that I understand correctly here, you built the UI in Webflow.
Uh-huh.
And when you say we registered the event listeners, you're talking about like arrow up, arrow down, right, left, space, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But as far as event listeners from like, I clicked the menu and then the menu showed up, you still did that in Webflow. Okay. So all of like the interactions still live in Webflow, like the UI lives in Webflow, but then you've got this like embed element that's taking up the whole screen. Your nav and your UI is on top of that embed element. And then the 3JS is just taking up the full screen of your embed element.
Yeah, except we're not having to embed it. So it's a difference. So an embed is like if you, like you embed a YouTube video. So what we're actually doing is we're instantiating an instance of that application and running that application natively inside of Webflow. That's yeah.
And are you doing that through the custom code portion of that page?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. And then you maybe have a container or something that is the full page, so it knows where to put it.
Yeah, exactly.
So the designer must be very sparsely populated.
Yeah, we can dig into it. But yeah, a lot of the pieces that are in the designer, so for a lot of the background elements, and again, like there's different ways that we can do this. So if I was to come back into here, that a lot of this, and so this is just like the video that I made for like the Webflow conference. I was trying to see how I can, So like all of that's, you can think of that as just almost like a video asset,
Yeah.
right? And so, but all of this is where we can have, all of the content, all these sort of like, UI nudges, the made in Webflow badge that's over on the right-hand corner, our sound controls, all this stuff, that's where we can go in and have those pieces in Webflow. And again, like the little sock icon, all of that stuff. And what we wanted to do is just like, see how can we start to bring these worlds together? We could have had so much more of the application being built just like within just Webflow itself. Like if we wanted to have, let's say, a calculator or things along those lines. And the net of this is just like, even for what Bryant was showing within DevLink, all DevLink is doing. So if we come back over here, DevLink is doing this. This is what we were doing. And you can do that. You can do what Bryant was doing with DevLink in terms of creating a weather application. You can do that today within Webflow with like actually a very little bit of code. And again, just like you're writing that application in one environment and then you're instantiating that within Webflow and then adding those listeners.
Did you have early access to DevLink to try to build letter?
No, I wish we did. No, we had to rewrite all of this. Like we got 7 or 8 months in, and then we were like, oh crap, like this isn't going to work. So we rewrote it all starting in May.
Out of curiosity, is this something that your team is doing in the cracks of their time, or is this something where you're like, no, this is going to be a showcase piece. We're going to have people really dedicated to this, and got 7 months in of a full team working on this?
What we had is we averaged about one full-time person throughout the year. And I didn't actually think it was going to be this big of a project. Because again, I just started here and I was like, oh, we're just going to take like the Edgar Allan logo, like we're going to like create a maze, and then, it's this guy and he kind of runs around. It'll be easy. It's like, how hard is that? And then unfortunately we got into this where it's like, oh, hey, look what Whit made. He like did this in 3JS and it looks really cool. And I was like, oh man, like, yeah, we got this little pill guy, and we made this within, I don't know, like maybe a month or so. Like we were just messing around. We extruded this, like it's and then like the next thing we were like, oh well, maybe what we can do is like, I mean, can we bring it into Webflow? And so like this is our first attempt to bringing it into Webflow. We're like, easy peasy, right? So it's just an embed object. But what you see is like we're actually not interacting with the two elements. And so we still had like a React element, and then we still had Webflow elements, and we hadn't actually created that link yet, or we hadn't figured out how to go and create that link.
So speaking of that link, you mentioned that you can somehow delegate an event from something in React, and then something in Webflow can respond to that. Can you show maybe an example, or how did you do that? That's interesting to me.
So I am probably not the person to show that. So
okay.
My background is I came up doing Flash design and developments. And so I understood when Whit told me like, oh, this is how I do it. I was like, that's exactly how I used to do stuff in Flash. But like, he's really the person that would be able to show sort of where those bodies are buried. So the main idea is those, again, have your core application and then set up, your event listeners and delegators within Webflow. Go for it, Kyle.
And so the question, Neil, if I'm understanding your question, is that you're understanding how you go from things on the screen of Webflow sending stuff to the React app, but what you're curious about is how does stuff that's happening in the React app then flow back to the Webflow to then manipulate Webflow?
Yeah. So for instance, you have that panel that slid out.
Yep.
Let's say something happened in React and you wanted to close that panel. How do you do that?
That's a great question, and I'll introduce you to Whit. I would say for today's conversation, it's really just about how to be able to create those swim lanes so that more people can work in Webflow. That's really the net of it. And I think for everyone to take on the excitement to say that you don't have to go in and do everything in a no-code application to really be working at, what I'd say is like the leading edge of no-code. And it's more around like, again, our priority is like, how can we empower authoring So for our end clients, what is that authoring experience going to look like? How can we go in and empower the most people possible on the team? So again, we went and redesigned the UI. I know the UI, it feels very minimal within Letterrun. We redesigned that probably like over the course of 3 or 4 months. I mean, it was like all of these, because we had never built a game before. We didn't know like what we were doing. Even like the intro, which is like very, minimal. We had like a more extensive like intro planned and all these things. And that's what we were able to really use the watering hole of Webflow to allow more people to come in and really be able to work kind of cross-discipline.
How, when you're talking about this authoring, are you saying that someone could go in on the Webflow side of things, like, I want to add another pair of socks to the R, and they could do that?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we actually have like a lot of stuff that we didn't release on the application, but we were able to figure out like how to go in and have another like 3D element that we're managing through the CMS. We were able to go and do multiplayer. So within Webflow, so that you could have multiple like little EAs running around. The things that the CMS does currently do is basically every single room has an element that you find, a hint. Here, I can pull up, like, we'll just jump into Webflow here. I'll pull up the file here so we can just go in and look at we'll look
while
at
you're
the
pulling it up,
designer.
while you're pulling it up, do you focus on authoring because you think Webflow has the best authoring experience for your clients?
Yes. So my sales line, and everyone can write this down and use it within their pitches, is that ultimately we're not trying to build a website for our client. We're trying to build a set of marketing tools that are going to empower them to do more with their team. And big part of that is that we're providing training and then the sort of building blocks so that if they have this idea on a Monday, they can turn around and react to it on a Tuesday. And we do this through, it's like, the CMS is the thing that's probably the most widely used, but now getting into symbols with content overrides. And when I guess now it's just like symbols that allow you to go and do multi-instance type of things. The thing that I'm most excited about kind of moving forward is really, it's like what I'd say are on the edges of Webflow. And so getting into authoring with symbols and then with the component libraries and things along those lines, and then DevLink. I think everything else, my other hot take is that it's a waste of time. The things I'm not excited about are logic. I'm not excited about members, translations. All of those are really businesses that should be created by other people and that Webflow should empower. And I feel like right now what's happening is that those projects are taking away focus from the other edges of the application. And if we're not careful, and Corey, I'm not trying to, but if we're not careful, we're going to end up with more like more e-commerce like features. So e-commerce, and I say this is because I've lived through it. So I'm working within the platform for the last like 8 years, was so excited about e-commerce. Actually, there was a point within our business where I was like, next year we're going hard into e-commerce. It's going to be Webflow e-commerce. Like we marketed the hell out of it. And then the product comes and it's just like, it's not there. And the same thing for memberships. Like you can't actually do anything like meaningful with memberships. And we have a big memberships project that we're working on right now. We're not using Webflow for it. We wouldn't be able to. And the same thing for logic. It's like, I think for logic, it's like by the time you really start to get into heavy duty logic, outside of saying like on form submission, go to here, then, you are basically getting into programming, which I think will be solved with like, what I'm really curious about is how we can go in and train a model to understand what is Webflow specific JavaScript. And then you just go and say, connect a form element to CMS collection named X. And then it just writes that and you copy and paste it and put it in there. And all I need to know is like, what's the variable that I need to hand hand over to it? And what's the prompts that I need to use to be able to get in there? And like when when I was coming up, and I'm sure, you know, Kyle, you as well, like you were talking about for a while, you were doing sort of like everything web dev, right? And so there was a time where, you know, it's like you're a full stack developer and you know, wearing that as a badge of honor and you missed out on one semicolon and it's like the whole thing blows up. And so this idea of like visual programming comes around and like, we don't have to worry about semicolons anymore, but now we have to worry about like, you know, this whole dominoes of stuff kind of like falling over. So that's where I think I want to be like, I guess like the other thing that I want to get into for next year is like, I worked really, really hard to make a name for Edgar Allan in the Webflow space. And the Webflow, what I'd say is like bubble. What I've come to realize is like, I want to actually help Edgar Allan and like a whole bunch of other people break out of the Webflow and no code bubble. And I think that's where we're going to have a real impact when we can go in and because we can get into this echo chamber of like everyone loves Webflow so much and it's like I love, you know, like Kyle and Neil and it's like we were giving high fives to everyone and we're like, oh man, it's like we're just like it's so awesome. And it's true. But now I think what we have to do is like we have to bring this one, it's like as much as I hate to say it, it's like I'm getting into LinkedIn. But you know, it's like I'm starting to like outside of Elon, you know, Elon Musk, like it's just like I'm like, okay, I've got to get what we're doing out into a larger audience. And the way that we're thinking is again, just like how to empower authoring, how can we move quickly, how can we empower the team, and then outside of there, it's like the tools are, you know, a secondary thing.
Okay, three things. One, I think everyone has said, I hate to say it, but I'm getting into LinkedIn. So I think everyone said that. Second, this is a safe space. And we always are poking and prodding Corey for the insight. And so it's maybe not a safe space for Corey as much, but we're always
platform for Corey.
Yeah. We're always like, hey, Corey, I don't know if anyone's listening, but I think you should send this back to the team.
Well, and they know, and like, I'm very like, if there's anything that Webflow does really, really well is I am probably on a call with a product person or a strategist or someone from enterprise sales, like maybe 2 to 3 times a month. And like they do a fantastic job of listening to their customers. And in fact, like I said, the same thing, I was invited to Nashville to talk with the all hands team. And I said the same thing, which is just like work on these barbells, but I'm bringing that to this group to say like, work on the barbells. You know, what is the way that you can empower authoring, or what is the way that you can do something that's more technical? And if you're working to empower authoring and you're on the design side or content side, like that's fantastic. But then start to get into things like content design or how to think about, you know, brand strategy, or it's like, what are you doing from a storytelling standpoint? Because that's the thing that, you know, it's if we look at the evolution of these tools that again, like 10 years ago, none of this was here. 10 years in a career is nothing as well. And so thinking about where the thing, you know, where technology is going to go, where the industries are going to go, I think that's where it's like be about creativity on this side, and then around kind of like problem solving on the more technical side. So tons of opportunity, but again, thinking bigger than kind of where the tools are today.
Can I ask a quick question too?
Yeah.
The way that you're using the word authoring, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding it right. Because do you mean kind of taking ownership of your site and your assets and being in the driver's seat with regard to managing that? Or are you talking a little bit more literally to do with content creation?
It's both, but mostly around like how you can go in and work with your website or whatever to be able to express, you know, whatever idea you have. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
in that case, I was understanding it correct, but I wanted to double check that you didn't have some kind of side hustle publishing enterprise that was integrated into this conversation.
So authoring is a term that's like on the, like when we're working with our enterprise clients and things on those lines, they're very concerned around like how they're going to be authoring content. And then they're talking in terms of, you know, web authors and things on the, like basically people that are working within the systems. And
kind of like as opposed to feeling like they are reliant on a system they can't fully operate.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
WordPress.
So WordPress is great at publishing, And there's a difference, I think, between publishing and authoring. And authoring is like rarely where you have more of that ownership. And the standard that I would like to hold tools like Webflow up to is like they should feel more like Google Docs. Like all of those little like, and they're called like quality of life improvements. Like that's the way it's kind of talked about. I think that's BS. I was like, these should be core product elements of like, how to be able to have like really beautiful, rich text and, just all of the things that go in and make a really great authoring system that is like Google Docs.
So if someone is, are you backing any technical horses from, for when it comes to, obviously React is a thing that is, backed by DevLink. You showed it there. Obviously 3JS is kind of like it's a niche thing, but are you backing any technical horses? And would you tell anyone who's kind of more technical, but they're wanting to get into this marriage of code and no code, would you tell them to go towards a certain technology?
Yeah, I mean, JavaScript, man, there is so much within JavaScript that like, if we can, and that's the other thing I was talking about, like kind of breaking the bubble. If we can have like JavaScript developers wildly excited about working within Webflow, man, like it's over, and that's where, we can, because that's what we're doing in our team. And we're just doing all sorts of stuff where, it's like, oh, we have this idea. And then it's like, go over to Pabs and he writes a little function and then we just go boop and we just like plop it in. And like Wit just goes and he like adds one variable and he's like, oh yeah, I just added this to, and we're basing these on like the attributes within inside of an element. So we're saying like, grab this attribute on this page, go and add it, done. And then otherwise like Pab's gone and written this thing, Pabs is really happy. So, I mean, Webflow for sure, like we are still like we're doing more Webflow work than we've ever done. And we can continue to see this really ramping up. And we're looking at like how we can now work with Webflow within a traditional application development cycle. I think one of the ideas from Bryant that was really powerful was like typically in a company, they only have 1 to 2 people that are on the marketing team, kind of working within the website, but they'll have like 40 people that are working in the app layer. And then, if we can go in and start to like, that's where, you want to start to talk about really interesting, kind of like parabolas here of kind of the rocket ship taking off. If we can, as Webflow developers, be able to go in there and take off all of that work that was really like wildly complicated, big systems of just like, storybook and like, designers fighting back and forth and lots of Jira tickets and like all this stuff, and basically just simplify that into working within a visual environment that has clear separation for like how a developer can work within what I'd call as like a first-class environment, then like we're good. Like, man, like no shortage of job opportunities, no shortage of ways to be able to make a real impact within a company.
Are there any what about database development? Are you riding hard on the CMS inside of Webflow, or do you see a world where you need an external database?
Yes. So we have a lot of external databases, and I see the Webflow collections as almost like RAM in a computer. So it's just in time memory type of thing, and that we're populating that to be able to handle things that are happening on the client. So in the presentation there, but otherwise, there's going to be a lot that's, that you're going to want to be infusing into that, or that you need to be able to have in other systems that you're connecting to, things along those lines. It's also probably not talked about that like DevLink is going to totally change so much around like Webflow and Webflow pricing and how we think about Webflow, because DevLink goes and takes everything inside of Webflow and then like puts that into another environment. And so like Webflow traditionally has been sold as just like sort of like this sealed package that you're going and buying. And so that's where now it's like not going to be that. or even, so the process that we're like, so if I was to screen share again, so I'll make a little, this is my like nerd joke. So this is like the workflow for DevLink. This is the workflow for what we call link dev. Link dev is the opposite of DevLink. So it goes in and takes an application and instantiates it into Webflow, as opposed to Webflow where you're going in and taking the Webflow part and you're pushing that out into the world. Now, one of the advantages with link dev is that here you can actually use the Webflow CMS as part of your React application, as opposed to with DevLink, you actually don't have any of that CMS natively unless you're kind of like making a connection back into it, which I was able to get Bryant to give me a demo, and we sort of talked about that. But again, two sides of the same coin, and it'll get weird. So.
Do you think that, and this is where we kind of look to Corey for sometimes, I'm just saying, do you think that DevLink is going to be like an enterprise tier thing, or is it like it's only for the top stuff, or it's going to be kind of like democratized so that anyone can, it's like an add-on?
I can answer this for Corey because I'm talking with the people that are trying to think about putting the pricing together, and I'll just like make sure that Corey stays away from his NDA. Is that there's the way that this is priced, no one knows. And I don't even think that Webflow thought that this was like, if I was to hypothesize, like, I don't even know if this was going to make it into the keynote. Or I mean, it's kind of just like a project that Bryant was working on, and they're like, I don't know, should we put it in there? And because there's a lot of it that's just kind of not figured out, and a lot of it that's gone against some of the initial stuff that, you know, has been worked on and things along those lines. So my guess would be that, you know, and I asked Bryant, I was like, well, what's going to happen? You know, it's like, I asked him, and it's like, well, you could just go in and price it to be really expensive. And his comment was, I wouldn't want to build something that I couldn't use as an independent developer. He's like, that just doesn't excite me. And so I think a lot of the spirit that, you know, we all react to of like, you know, just how Webflow feels as a company really ladders up to, it's like, you know, three people, Bryant, Sergi, and Vlad, and then it kind of like has propagated out there to people like Corey, and, you know, just like a lot of those values are just human values. So I have full trust that there will be ways for a lot of people to work within it.
I do agree though. I remember at Webflow Conf when the DevLink thing came up, and I was like, whoa, now we're talking, and then it's over, because it was like the last 2.5 minutes of the entire thing. So
and then everyone's like just like, what is this going to mean? And again, I think that,
what does this mean?
yeah, like it's going to open up so many more jobs and so many more opportunities than anything else that was presented at Webflow Conf, like hands down.
So one of the things that I thought this is like a year, or, you know, thing that's for you, and please feel free if anyone else, well, first off, if you have questions or if you agree with what I'm about to say, chime in. But there was a time that I started thinking about this a couple of years ago. I was like, I'm so thankful that I got into Webflow when I did, which was like 4 years ago, because I was like, the platform is just like the layers of the onion have started to grow and grow and grow. And I was like, I can't imagine learning Webflow now. And what I'm wondering is, does DevLink make it even harder to, I mean, I understand they're like totally different things, and you can like go in and not, you know, but like, does it muddy the waters enough that you're like, you can do anything? Like you could build an app, you could do and then you're like, oh my God, I can like build an app in Webflow with like React, and now I've got to learn React. And so what I'm wondering is like, does it make it more like what, or maybe a better way to phrase this is, what do the new people who have never touched Webflow, like, are they like screwed, or is there still hope for those people that are just
no. Yeah, I mean, and even looking at the core product, like, it's funny, I mean, we've been working in it for 8 years, and so much of it is still the same, like the exact same, and getting in and like doing, like, we started using it so that we could go in and not have to write red lines, because we were working with a company that was using Adobe Experience Manager. And I was like, oh my gosh, if I've got to go in and write red lines for all of these little like padding things one more time, like I'm just kind of like, you know, poke my eyes out. And the other thing is like, it's like we had project management teams and everyone's telling us to move faster. And I'm like, we can't move faster because we've got to go and measure 1,000 little things. And then the dev team's going to come back and say like, oh, you guys didn't measure this. And fundamentally, like today, like we can go in and we can create a beautiful layout. We can create a beautiful layout for whatever we want. And then if we really want to get into, some different animations, things along those lines, like, yeah, that's, it's starting to get into like a little bit more complex. CMS is fairly straightforward. And I think if anything, the challenge is just going to be more around like, again, like what is your imagination, sort of, where is it taking you? What do you want to do? And what is, this, it's really easy to go in and design a thing that looks like an application. It's really hard to design something that someone wants to use, something that someone wants to invite into their life, something that someone wants to pay for. Same thing for a marketing site. Like, hey, let me go in and even make this weirder. Okay, Webflow announced that all of a sudden that there's all these pre-built pattern libraries and everyone is super excited about being able to work with systems like, Reloom. But what happens like when we go and take all the complexity out of web design? What's left for the web designer? It's like, well, we just went and went boop, 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 it's like, and we're doing these speed build challenges and we're like, oh man, like we did it in 24 hours, but it's like, you can't get a high enough volume of client base to be able to sustain a business of doing 24-hour turnaround on sites, like just even contracting, getting people to pay you, finding customers, like all this stuff. So I think where we're pushing into is like, okay, again, gets back into a lot of the stuff that's accelerating. It's all starting to accelerate. And I think that's the thing. It's like, what do you do when this world is accelerating around us? And what we've focused on for a long time is more of the questions of like what we're going to build and how we're going to build something. Even a lot of the questions that are around like Webflow today are like how we're going to be building things. And I think the questions that we're going to have to start asking is like why we're building things. And, it's like, so it's like, yes, we have this hero up here, but why is that up there? Okay, well, we tested it. Okay, well, now we have to figure out how to do multivariate testing. Like now we have to figure out like, what's the data on this? Like all this other sort of stuff. And so it's like, yes, we can go in and build, 10x faster, but can we build, something that converts at a 10x, and that converting it at 10x is still going to take time.
Speaking of conversion, I'm curious, what has Letter Run done for Edgar Allan? Have you gotten a lot of business from that? Has it had any sort of an impact?
It's an interesting question. It has been transformational for us in many ways. And then it's just kind of like another day at the office in other ways. So, I would say the bigger thing that I learned from Letter Run was like how to build with an audience. And so like building in public is one of these things that I've just sort of like been like, like it feels, I don't know, like it kind of feels bro-y. I don't know like the best way to say this, but it's like so tech bro-y. And it's just like, oh, you're just gonna need to have a newsletter and you build in public. And I was just like really turned off about that.
I always think it's just everybody have this as an excuse to post their Stripe account.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but it was really a turnoff for me. But I did like from the very beginning, we started collaborating, I think, on Twitter and kind of showing progress. Because the other thing is like I didn't know we were going to finish. So I kind of wanted to get credit for whatever work that we had done. Because there was a lot of times where I was just like, this thing is gonna just like crash and burn. And it either felt like Christmas or a nightmare, like depending on the day that I woke up. I was like, oh my gosh, we just figured out how to do something. And I was like, this is never gonna work. We need to burn it all down and just give up now. So that was sort of the cycle that we went through. And I would say the biggest impact was really the day that I posted the tweet saying like, hey, here it is. And it was interesting because like, even before that, I put a lot of effort into the presentation for the Webflow conference, but the way that the conference was organized, it was like there was the online portion and then there was the offline portion. I actually didn't talk with anybody in person about Letter Run while I was at Webflow conference because it sort of didn't exist, which I was sort of surprised about. Like those talks just sort of didn't happen. I had 2 talks and like neither, like they could have sort of not happened. And but I did, I think, afterwards, like whenever we're talking with customers now and they say like, well, what are the limitations of Webflow? And I'm like, well, I mean, what you thinking? So it's given us like a point of credibility, and that's been probably the biggest thing. Like I think it did a lot to help us build relationships. Within Webflow, I've been able to talk with people that I hadn't been able to talk with previously. And yeah, like I don't know. I think
You have a
for
seat at
us,
tables. Do you have a seat at tables you otherwise wouldn't have?
I don't know if we've got a seat, but at least like people know about us. So you would like it has not like how about this? Here's a horrifying stat is that at the Webflow conference, I hadn't sold all of our work for November or December. So and like this is like typically, like our sales looks like this. Like it always just looks like this. And we have about 10 weeks of visibility at any given time of projects sold at full capacity. I would now after the conference, like when we had deals that were sort of like lining up and things along those lines, but it's not like we didn't have like a sea of people that are like, oh my gosh, you know what I need? I need like a 3D environment with a big logo that runs inside of Webflow. That hasn't happened. But
how long do your projects normally take? So when you say we got 10 weeks of visibility, from soup to nuts, like client signs the stuff and then we start doing and I understand every project's different, but like what are you looking at?
It ranges. If we're doing Webflow only, then that can be like 3 to 4 weeks. If we're doing brand to build, that's 14 to 16 weeks, sometimes 22.
Wow. You're firing through them.
That's speedy.
I posted all this last week on I did a roundup of like our numbers. So I was going through like my spreadsheets, and we were averaging about 21 projects a month right now, 22 projects a month.
Oh, how big's your team?
34 people.
Wow.
And so we average on, like when I'm doing my estimations, like one full-time person per like that's how I budget. So, and I know this is like, I don't know if this is really into the topic of like
this is where the discussion devolves or evolves, and now we just
we're at that point.
Yeah, cool. I just wanted to like I like the net of like, I think if I have a point to make here, it is just like find the things you really love to work on, and like whatever those things are, it's okay. And if you want to be like really technical, then there is like room for you within Webflow, and you can go and write like these beautiful pieces of JavaScript that we're instantiating inside of Webflow. And then if you really love design and like sort of like kerning all the tight inside of Webflow, then like there is a place there where you can start to meet hands with our technical cohorts. And then even if you're just really excited about as a writers, I think that's the next big like push, is like being able to just go in and be like, okay, I need a hero and then a left and right. And that's where we'll have this other wave of people that come in and start to work within Webflow that we're really empowering, again, on the authoring side. So that's the sort of net of it. But yeah, I'm happy to go in and answer like any questions around like agency side, like what's it meant, kind of building up stuff, things like that.
Well, I say if I were to take this back a little bit, then to sort of circle back around to the topic you came to the table with, one of your controversial hot takes from earlier in the meeting was that visual design has a 3-year lifespan tops. So I'm interested to come back to that, because I feel like you dropped that bomb about like 2 minutes in, and then we all just sat tight, or at least I certainly did. So starting
I'll clarify that. So I think defining visual does like working visually and visual programming has a beautiful life ahead of ourselves. I think trying to visually program logic has a limited lifespan. And so that's where, if you're dragging boxes around to be able to do things, there's some use cases where it still works, but I just wouldn't go in and like dedicate a career to it, or even like I would avoid like even so this is just for me, and it's like I love FinSuite and I love what they're doing with Wiz, but like I would avoid Wiz and I would just focus on JavaScript, because I think that's really where you're going to see more power in 3 years.
So put another way, Webflow has a future, and when I say Webflow, I mean the visual design of a web interface. Webflow has a future. Zapier, you think is on the outs from a visual, like to use two tools as like to encapsulate what you're saying.
I would say that there's, I mean, like Zapier does, like what Zapier does great is like, if you need to be able to plug something from right here to right here and just like, oh, I need to go and do this to this, like, that's great. I think when you're trying to think about how to go in and create these really complicated, like logic flows and things on those lines, that Zapier, one, is fragile no matter what. And you're just better off saying, like, getting to a breaking point to say like, okay, now this is better off with just traditionally written JavaScript.
Is Make more sturdy or less fragile than Zapier? I just feel that way, but I don't know if that's true.
So again, these are great tools and we use them all the time. Both of them. And I don't have actually an opinion. I see other people banging their head against the keyboard. I mostly just try to sell the keyboards, if this makes sense. Like, I think it's just to be careful and to understand like where the market is going, from my opinion, is not towards laying out blocks for logic. I think the market for me is going towards things that are even more declarative. Because again, I've been looking at declarative programming since Flex. So let me just take you back. Flex was a product that was made by Macromedia to encapsulate Flash. And it was going from descriptive Flash programming to declarative Flash programming. So I've been thinking about this for a while. So I think working in Webflow is going to continue to be a wildly powerful, lots of room there. But just before you go down the logic rabbit hole, that's where I think it's like, you'll just be jumping into ChatGPT to get a lot of this stuff or something like that.
I just like to echo, I think Zapier is extraordinarily fragile and super hard to troubleshoot. I had a very specific use case of when I get a new order from Stripe, I wanted to go and do something in my CRM. And, first I had to do a lookup, then I had to figure out whether it was a lead or an existing client. If it was a lead, I wanted to convert it, blah, blah, blah. And Zapier just, doing that in there was a nightmare. And then I found a tool called N8N.io that bridges the gap. It still has this visual layout, but it's got enough blocks that you can do manual callouts. Like if you just need to call some REST API, there's a block for that. If you need to do just a little bit of JavaScript and transform like one JSON into another JSON, there's a little block for it.
Is that working in conjunction with Zapier or as a
complete replacement, total competitor?
I'm assuming it's pronounced Nation, the N8N. Is that the idea? Nation.io?
I have no idea how to even pronounce it. I just found it online when I was sick of Zapier breaking on me with no error handling.
Is that
heard it as N8N?
You've never heard it, or you've heard it as
Nation?
I
have. Yeah, I've only ever heard it as N8N.
Oh.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna go and look at this. I haven't looked at this.
Yeah, it's cool. I used a little bit. There was an automate all the things. There was a conversation with a fellow or a stream with him. Somebody who uses it a fair bit months back.
Someone who was saying that they like it and they recommend it.
Yeah, they use it all the time. I've used it a little bit. It was kind of handy for a special thing I was trying to do.
So why would you use this over Make? And I suppose that, they're all flavors. It's Coke, Pepsi kind of thing, maybe. But curious if anyone knows what the.
If you want, I can give you a quick screen share, and you can see exactly.
Yeah.
Why we use it.
While you're pulling that up, is getting the email from Zapier that says there's an error in one of your zaps, is that the most frustrating, annoying email that you can get?
Yes, it's horrifying.
It's the worst.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So this is our execution of when I get an order from Stripe, where I go and I look up things in our Zendesk CRM, and then either send things out to SendGrid or update things in either our Zendesk tool for support, or creating a lead or updating the lead or updating the contact. And we do a little bit of functions, like here's just a little bit of JavaScript where you can transform things, and it gives you a really cool visual but data friendly view. So you get your input, and actually it even tells you this is the actual execution of it, where you can kind of see exactly what happened. So here was the input coming in, and then you could see what happened on the output. So it gives you all of the data, and it records it too, so you can actually see what happened. So if this failed, I could see exactly what was the input, and then exactly what conditions failed here.
Click on that false branch, one item.
So that's the result of this Boolean condition.
Yep.
So it's basically just trying to see if.
And then that probably sends you down another path of your little visual guy.
Yep. So really what I'm checking here is whether this was a live mode order or a test mode. And then if it was test mode, then it just sends an email. Or if it isn't live, it just does nothing. But if it was a live order, then it goes and does all this processing.
Yeah, visually it's reminiscent of what Connor showed in the last meeting of the make automation, because in make it shows the automation map too, but it looks as though this is friendlier for the little blocks of code, or data friendly as you put it. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
It looks a lot like Parabola to me. I haven't used Parabola in a while, but when I was using it a couple of years ago with the error messages and things like that for testing, and it looked almost exactly like Parabola in this flow chart as well.
Is there something that's happened? Is there like some sort of a plugin or something that has enabled these apps and these teams to more quickly build this interface and this experience? Or like, why are we seeing this kind of a thing so kind of rapidly disperse around the internets? You know, like, is there something that's enabling the rapid development of these kinds of apps? Or is it just people mimicking each other?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, but I think, like, you just look at all the JavaScript frameworks that are out there and all the different ways to be able to build for the web. And, there's no shortage of like these just crazy amount of tools. And even like, this is a great example of, like, this is awesome. And like, I think if you have like one sort of like specific use case, again, and I had even mentioned like, hey, I have a form that needs to go from here to here, or, it's like this happens and this happens. And I think that, Rachel, my comment is really that even to get to this point, Neil had to understand a whole lot around programming. And he's got like, you're like, oh, I'm doing a visual, I'm doing a Boolean thing. And then I need to like, you're doing all this stuff that isn't just like going in and like kerning the type and setting like the padding, and like visual development for visual environments is perfect for designers. And then I think like you're getting into this, and this is really a programming environment. And then it's like you happen to pick this tool because you're like, oh, I just need to do this, and I just really don't feel like writing out all these functions or whatever. And that's great. And I think if the word of caution that I want people to take away is that if you're more visually minded, then just like go really hard on like visual design. And then if you have the propensity to like be able to understand like these logic statements and things on those lines, start to get into the foundation of like what is programming, and then start to understand, like once you understand like, arrays and variables and, global objects and like, what is a matrix and all of this stuff, then you can start to apply that in a variety of ways, kind of outside of like any tool and these tools are just going to propagate, right? So they're just going to be like this one's out here. And then like, that's like now all of a sudden, like Framer's doing weird stuff. I had to explain to a client today on like why they shouldn't use Framer. And I was like, you can use it. I was like, it's basically Muse from Adobe, like, 10 years ago. And it's cool. Like it goes just directly from Figma, and then you can go like, and it's like got these hard breakpoints. But anyway, so it's just about fundamentals.
So you're saying you think in 3 years, the chat GPs of 3 years from now will be able to do this?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
The what? The chat GPs?
That was the thing that Mason.
Yeah,
was showing
the
earlier.
the chat GTP. I mean, yeah, like I mean, it can already go and basically write this JavaScript. Like you can go and tell it to write just like crazy hard JavaScript, but you have to know what is programming. So again, like you have to understand programming before you can get here, right? So you have to understand programming before you can get here. To even like what Neil has. And then for a lot of the other stuff, like what you're going to go and write is like you're going to say like, okay, what are the 12 functions that I need to write to be able to do the X application? So it's going to list those out, and you're going to say, okay, now go and write those individually, and say, okay, now I'll go and add this service. And again, it's generative, and it is a different way to think about no code. That's probably the thing that's probably happening before our eyes, is like we've been thinking about no code in this type of environment. We're about to go to a world in which we are being even more, because again, all no code is like, how do we communicate with machines? And so now we have the ability to directly communicate with machines. I'm also like not just like a science fiction person. I was not on the crypto thing. I don't have any NFTs. I am not a bandwagon person. I did not want to go in, like I'm not like a build in public and have a newsletter. I have no newsletter. Like Edgar Allan has no newsletter. But like what we're experiencing has changed the world dramatically. And I would also say, I was like, we were doing a lot of this stuff even before it came out, and just thinking about how to extend Webflow.
Well, we would know that if you had a newsletter, Mason.
I know. Well, if I had some help, I did find yeah, go for it.
I'm kidding.
Maybe to answer Kyle's question about where this kind of environment is coming from, I used to do a lot of audio work, and I kind of like Mason grew up in Flash, and we used to do audio soundtracks and things like that. So using Logic Audio and Ableton and programs like that, they've got visual programming environments that look a lot like Make and Parabola, where you're connecting MIDI devices and stereo in and outs and putting effects and other things. So you're kind of programming your audio environment, and a lot of this kind of looks like that same sort of environment, visual environment that you're working with. And those tools have been around for like 10 years at least, if not longer.
Interesting.
Well, and
There
that
was,
kind of
before we
makes
go-
sense, because you've got, plugging equipment together is
Well, it's
very
just like-
visual,
yeah,
right?
those mental models of like a pedal to a thing or whatever. I didn't want to, before we get too far down, Stella, you had a question. So I wanted to make sure that we got to it here. What's the best way to use Webflow to fix an existing dynamic website? Do you want to dig into that? I would generally say tear it all down and start over, but I'd love to have more context.
Okay, I was working for Eurofins, and they have existing website already. It's a dynamic website. It has a lot of database. So they want to change the UI, and I was the UI UX designer, and I introduced Webflow, but they think that code is so different that they can't, maybe it takes longer for them to implement everything from Webflow. So it's a kind of debating, they don't want to use Webflow sometimes.
Yeah, so if something is on an existing platform, doing a platform change can be difficult. And it has nothing to do with sort of code or no code. It's mostly just that you have to clean up that code, or sorry, the content that's coming out of there, and then be able to figure out how to migrate that over. We are working, so I'll talk about this here. We're working on a tool right now that we call MAT. So it stands for Migration Automation Tool. And what we can do is look at a collection, so like an events collection, or basically anything that is a repeated element within a website, and then abstract that out and then strip that down to CSV that we can then import into Webflow. So that's something that we have working today, and we're looking at kind of rolling it out within 2023.
As like a tool for the community.
Yeah. Yeah. And so trying to take down the barrier. So for Stella, like what you're looking at is like, you're like, hey, I'd like to be able to migrate us over. Whereas like, this seems like a really great solution. A business owner is going to say like, great, but I have 3,000 pages that are kind of locking me into a platform. And so if we can remove that barrier and say like, yeah, you have 3,000 pages, but 2,980 of them we can take over kind of like with very little effort within a couple of days, then all of a sudden like you can start migrating people into new platforms more easily.
Yeah.
Mason, is that going to be, I mean, I know WordPress has got a plugin like WordPress all export, WordPress all import. Is it going to be like a tool that you can use with like Magento or Drupal or any other platform?
Yeah. So it builds on another tool that we've built that we haven't actually launched called West. So West allows us to do some different things for Webflow deployment. But what we got really good at there was how to go in and do these snapshots of a website. And so now what we're doing is we're taking that same technology and then saying like, okay, go and take a snapshot of this website and then go in and strip out all of like, go and find the repeating elements and then grab those repeating elements. So I can I can give a demo of that within the next probably month or so. And like WordPress does this. That one challenge we found is that sometimes when a company is trying to migrate off of their WordPress instance, the agency that controls that doesn't want to give us access to install that plugin or doesn't want to be a good partner. I know it's like throwing up roadblocks, but this allows us where we can just point. Basically, all we do is we take the URL, we throw it in there, or we go and grab a sitemap for what we want to do, and then it just chips through those pages, and it's saying like, okay, this had H1, this image, and then it just comes through in a CSV.
I like web scraping.
I like to call it rendering. I like to call it server-side rendering.
Okay.
It's all how you look at things, but
yeah. Penny, you had a question.
Well, I was going to say that I actually used N8N. That was the use case that I had for N8N was a client had a site built on Weebly way back when, and it's just like nasty as hell. But I couldn't. There was no way of exporting her blog 75 blogs, right? And I used N8N, and I can't remember exactly how I did it. I think it was sort of half manual, half automated. But I set up, here's the title, here's the text area, here's the image, and I could pull that out using that. But I would love to, have had a tool like what you're talking about building.
Did it work?
Yeah.
Yeah, it did. I mean, I still had a lot of manual work to do, and I didn't entirely know what I was doing, but I did manage to actually scrape it out and
render it.
Yeah.
Render it out.
Server-side rendering.
Yes,
and
I had to
abstracting
yes, I was able to render it out. I then had to I pulled it into Airtable and did some more work before I imported it, but I was able to get it out.
So the two things that we're looking at is like how to go in and basically identify collections, and then what you're going to pull out, and then how to have repeatable filters. Because a lot of times, like that's what you're doing within the spreadsheet is then you're saying like, okay, well now I'll go in and take out like all the extra paragraph tags that are within this rich text area or like whatever it might be. Yeah. And even if we just get like 80% of the way there, because a lot of the times, like, just like site migrations, it's such a pain for us.
They are.
Cool.
This has been really good conversation. I mean, I just want to say, Mason, thank you so much for putting this together, for sharing your thoughts. I know it's probably late for some people out on the our fellows to the north. It's a little late if you're up, east of Toronto, and I know Mason, you're on the East Coast, right? Did you say Atlanta?
Yeah, I'm in Atlanta. Yeah.
I think I don't want to tell everyone that they have to leave, but I also wanted to let everyone know that if you need to leave, we understand that people have lives.
Yeah.
So, take.
I should also note that I forgot to include Penny in the non-American list before, and I hope I didn't upset you with that.
I don't think she wasn't here at that time.
Okay, okay. Well, for the record, Stella, it's you, me, and Penny.
I mean, she's in Canada.
Came in as a late arrival. Hi, Mohammed.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I was late. I almost missed it, but I was scrolling through something and there was an ad that said running boosts creativity. And I was like, that sounds like Mason. And I was like, oh, wait, that's the night. It's not Tuesday.
Yes, I'm glad that didn't throw people off too much, actually. I was concerned. So thank you for helping us out with our hectic Christmas scheduling.
Yeah,
I do have my last question that I had on my list here. We've talked about, we've thrown out these words like, I can't even think of them all right now, but like, I don't even think you said this one, but like refactoring and declarative and these are you talked about in the survey, we were talking about, do you need to know code in order to know code? And you talked, well, it's not really coding, it's more programming and it's more conceptual and understanding the concepts of this. And what I'm wondering is, does anyone, and maybe Mason, you have it, or does anyone else have any good resources for people who are or maybe on the no coding side of things, and they're more on like the, hey, I learned some no code tools. I don't know all the concepts, but I know I know like the visual design aspect, but I don't know the concepts to keep up. Are there good resources or tools or anything? What would you recommend, kind of group question, what would you recommend to people who are trying to learn more programming concepts as they get deeper into this whole no code thing? Talk amongst yourselves.
So Neil, you just posted something. What'd you post up here?
Yeah, I posted a link to the Odin project. Now, this is kind of the opposite of no code, but it's a very beginning primer to web development, such that they even start you out at what is HTTP, what is DNS, what does it mean to even go to a website? And the real reason I love this particular project, one, I think they've got like maybe 4 months worth of exercises that are expertly created. But the real reason I love them is they have a Discord channel that you can go in, and there are literally, and I'm one of them, there's literally 40 professional web developers that will answer your question as long as it's related to one of these projects. And so if you're like, hey, I'm doing this Flexbox thing and I'm trying to move the frog from the left to the center, but it's not aligning right. And if you post a code pen or a JS fiddle, somebody will go in and show you exactly what your mistake is or what help you learn through it. And they don't just fix it. They'll literally sort of use the Socratic method and ask you the questions about it so that you learn how to fix it yourself. Yeah. But by the end of it, if you go through the whole Odin project, you'll be well on your way to a web development path. But it's all of these that are the basic concepts that, are very applicable to using something like all these no-code tools, because you're just trying to get the snippets to plug in the glue, right? Yep. So 90% of programming is somebody's out there programming all the glue and all the abstraction layers and all the engines and all that. But at the end of the day, you just want to use a little bit of JavaScript to fetch some data from an API and then spit it out into a nice, pretty grid.
Well, troubleshoot, like you mentioned earlier, Neil, if you want to troubleshoot something that you've built in no code, it's really tough to do without understanding the conceptual components behind it.
Things like, we talk about all these no code tools and we talk about, collections and this and that, but there's so little about how to actually structure all of that, right? Especially how to build a good database, right? And that sort of understanding of how to put your collections together. I see that there's like a whole database. Of course, I'm actually going through a 20-year-old book right now called Database Design for Mere Mortals. I'm on about page 4 right now. I've had this book for 20 years. I still haven't dug through it.
That's kind of,
But I'm trying.
as I was on a front end web development, come from that background, and it's kind of like, class naming and how many, and this is something interesting that no code has kind of shattered for me, but like how many divs should you use? What's the structure of your HTML page? What should that be? And so these are things where it's like, the elements, what the properties are, how to like call a function, but what's a good function? What's a good database? What's it's best practices, I guess, is really what it is. But
yeah, and you see that that need out there. I mean, even within the Webflow community, and people kind of looking at like, how should I name my classes? And it's like, is div 185 a good class name? I don't know. And so yeah, and I would, and I don't know if there's people here, but I would love to actually think about how to have a recurring conversation, which is just the topic is like programming for no code, and like how to be able to get to those fundamental basics of just like an array, a variable, like, even like what an API is, because like for a long time, like an API, even like like in my Flash days, like it intimidated the hell out of me.
Yeah.
And even now, like I'm like, I don't know, like I've never worked with the Webflow API, like other people on the team have, but I haven't. So yeah, I would love to just like figure out how to bring more to that conversation.
So go ahead, Penny.
I was going to say one of the people I have learned some of that from is Aaron Kornblatt through Automate All the Things, and I have to wonder whether him being on the education team might bring some of that knowledge and perhaps shape some of that education.
Now, the interesting thing with Aaron is he doesn't come from a development background, I don't believe. I think he learned it after. But he had that deal with Connor, code meets no code. Did you ever hear about that? Anyone? I was a member. Penny, you were in there, right?
Yep.
So they started this thing called code meets no code, and it was all about basically how do you extend it's literally what we should have invited them. It was literally what we're talking about tonight. How do you extend these no code tools to include code and do things beyond the capabilities of the tool? It was a circle community. They had a bunch of videos. A lot of it was, they had like a whole course on Airtable scripting and bringing that in, and which is a lot, which is JavaScript. And I think with Aaron moving over to Webflow and Connor being probably super busy, they shut it down after, was it a year, Penny?
It's just shutting down now. Yeah.
But it's very apropos to what we're talking about.
Absolutely. It's how I learned more about APIs. That's really the place where I've learned, between his streams and code meets no code, and the videos that he put together just on, here's how to use Postman, here's how to test something, here's how to, and I used that when I started using Webflow Logic. I used Postman to figure out whether or not I could make the connection before I tried to use it in Webflow.
Do you think Postman's kind of like, there's a learning curve there?
I've got a quick question since we're talking about this. Is there any workaround to when you go back to a saved instance of Webflow and it rewrites all the IDs and it breaks all your connections for Parabola or Make? Or have you not ever had that happen, Kyle? Because if you happen on a big project and
you can't. There's no way.
Are you saying if you go back and you're like set the past one as the live version, or even if you just open it up?
If you set it as the past version, like if something was broken and you want to fix it and you want to go back to a previous instance of it, if you set that, Webflow resets all the IDs in your collections and things like that.
No way around it.
Don't store backup.
I learned that the hard way. I was working on a really large project and something was broken, and the founder said, well, let's just restore the project. And I didn't know any better at the time. We had a bunch of parabola stuff running, and it broke everything. And I know from my WordPress days, I mean, I remember writing a plugin that for Google Analytics, that whenever you updated your WordPress version, Google Analytics would get dropped out of the head code. So I had a plugin that would reinstall Google Analytics back into the WordPress install. So I was wondering if there was any sort of JavaScript sort of thing you could do with Webflow that would automatically update those IDs when they were reinstituted.
I think that's one of those things for me that's been a workflow thing. It's like, if you need to look at a backup, you can copy and paste anything out of a backup if you haven't experienced that. So if it's like layout bugs, you can do that. Otherwise, just like best practices of like, if you're going to make major changes to a page, duplicate it and draft the page, like that kind of stuff, like I think is the biggest thing that at the end of the day is also knowing that, you know, backups can't serve that purpose, especially when you're working in like environments with clients that have actual engineering teams and things that are like very used to that. Oh, something's wrong, just throw the trigger and roll it back. It's like, no, don't do that. Yeah. One quick thing I was going to add on the education thing earlier, Kyle, is like my one, I think thing is, at least for myself, that it's taken me years to figure out, and I still don't feel like I haven't fully figured out, but before you like decide what you want to learn or where you want to learn it, decide how you best learn. Because I have probably like 5 paid JavaScript courses that I bought with stipends or something like that, and then I'll start and then I never finish. And I've read books and all that for years, and I have learned maybe 10% of my valuable working knowledge of something like JavaScript is from those things, and 90% is from actual projects. Like even the Odin one was a great example that there was some projects in there, but like, and no offense on Odin, I just more times than not have experienced those things as like, they're just really cheeky, not real projects. Like and it's not just that the use cases aren't real, but they don't have a deadline. They don't have somebody else expecting it to work. So like, it's, I don't know. I've just learned so much about how quickly I can learn about the web and the way it works when you're using it in a real world scenario and being willing to be a little bit vulnerable to be like, I think we can do that. Let's give it a try. Or, you know, and then just do searching and find Kyle's awesome Airtable script video or something like that. Then you use and then modify and then learn, and then use and then modify and learn. And then I think what's funny too about all the courses is like like there's even been a couple engineers at Webflow that I've kind of like paired with just to like learn and things. And the reality is, and again, Neil can probably contest, is like, it's all Googling, or what he was referring to earlier of just like duct taping things and gluing things together. You know, like at the end of the day, I think that's been my biggest thing too. And again, not that I am any expert, is that like, the reality is you will never, ever, ever memorize all that you think you need to understand something like JavaScript or whatever it is. The reality is you just need to know those like core fundamentals and terms and like how to Google. Like Mason, to your question, like, should we have this like education? Like, how has no one released something yet on how to Google as a no coder? Like how to find the solutions? Like, I don't know. Anyways, end rant.
Yeah.
No, that's a great, like, learning how you learn is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So
I think learning how
important.
you learn, and again, I think there's like maybe we just need to start building something, and maybe it's the how to Google as a no coder to program, or how to program as a no coder. And yeah, and I think having just some of those core fundamentals, and Neil, maybe it's something, you know, maybe you or Adrian could help with or whatever. Like, you know, what's a variable, what's an array? Here's the other crazy thing is like, you can go and take broken code today, put it into chat GTP, and it'll actually fix it for you and tell you what you did wrong. And it'll document it for you.
So I was playing around with chat GPT today with some coworkers. We were like we sent out a little like for my company. We sent out like a little holiday card. I know you like, you know, you rewrite, it takes you an hour to write this thing, 'cause you're like trying to say it right. I put it in, I was like, write a holiday thank you card to clients for, being being loyal. This thing spit out 2 paragraphs, real short, it was beautiful prose. It was unbelievable. Like this ChatGPT thing is unreal.
It's a solid C student, right? And it's the average, but it gets back to just, again, starting to get to the why and starting to, I'll say this, I responded to an RFP last week and I used ChatGPT for about 4/5 of it, of like these answers. Cause they were like, tell us about Webflow security. And I was like, really? And I was like, and then it's like, here, Webflow security is like all this stuff. But understanding like the why and the fundamentals and how to piece stuff together. I mean, it's basically just like super, it's like for Corey, you were talking about pairing. Pairing is really important. That's something that it's really tough to do. And I think if there's something that, no coders can do a little too much of, it's this feeling that I just have to do it all myself, or that I'm going to sort of go it alone. And that the community is so supportive, but then everyone just like gets so heads down and they're just like, oh, well, I just have to figure this out. And it's like, no, just ask someone to write you a function, or or try to write it yourself, or, find that swim lane for the thing you're really good at, and then start to find other people that you can work with to pull into your swim lane or be able to pull into your project.
Totally.
I think,
Oh, go
I
ahead.
think maybe that comes with time and getting used to who to talk to, right? Because I learned so much by just sitting on calls with people, or sitting on a live stream and finding out who knows what. Because otherwise it's like, well, you're not even sure where to start asking people.
Yeah, and I think something you also alluded to earlier, Mason, about even like whiz or examples like that. I think something I've observed is that in the no code space, we also are very quick to just jump on another solution that's like a tool or some utility somebody built, which like I don't even think it's a no code space. It's just like the development space is like, yes, some new npm package, let me dump that sucker in there. And it's like, I again, let me be clear, I am no pro, but if I've learned anything that reduces my stress and help me find solutions quicker, is reducing the number of tools I use. So even on like the whole Zapier conversation of earlier, it's like I would much rather find a way to, for example, I'm doing Airtable and Webflow. I'm going to do all my automations in Airtable if I can, so that I just have less things that can break, right? Or even, again, to the Wiz example, like there's a lot of those things that it's doing that you can write with like not a lot of JavaScript. And there's a very real difference between front end and back end. And so it's like, just understanding your medium, and even on the CSS front of like layouts and all that, it's like people are so quickly to everybody's using this one, so I'm just going to use that one, before they even understand like why it would be used that way, or maybe you shouldn't use it that way, or the different use cases, right? And I think what's funny too is back to what you said at the very earlier on the education thing, Kyle, was like about people learning it. It's like I that's why I love Webflow. At the end of the day, is like I have learned so much about code just by using the damn product, because like it is not overly abstracting it, it is so true in a way to all that terminology and all those things. And like even internally at Webflow, that's something I've had to I'm nobody. I'm just somebody on the side, but I have voiced my opinion very strongly multiple times about how important I think that terminology is on things like branching, for example. That there was a time of like, should it be called merge when you bring the branch back in? It's like, absolutely yes, because like that is a term to development. And yes, the merge is not technically same as a git merge, right? But it's like, the point is that all of these terms matter because they all accumulate into what you learn and then what you Google to find a solution to something you can't fix, like it's interesting how they all interconnect. And I think sometimes it's so easy to just look right past that to, I need to get the thing done, whatever. I don't know.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing to that. Corey, have you advocated to have a mode in the dropdown, which is like developer, designer, and editor?
so many times.
Yeah.
Especially because like the irony is that there is a very real world with it, which if anybody here has like worked with people that are just learning Webflow, right? Like I love this. Like I work out of this little office in downtown where I live, and there's a couple of people recently that have started hanging out in there and are learning Webflow. And one of the biggest challenges is layout, just like how do I make columns or how do I make this, right? And part of that is because, again, it stays true to CSS, and CSS in itself is not, it's partially complicated for a reason because of scalability and flexibility and all those other things that like the genius that goes in behind it. And so there's this like, there's always been this thing internally at Webflow of like trying to solve that problem. How do we make layout easier? And, I agree, it's probably a problem to solve, but that, what you just said, Mason, is always like, that's fine if you want to solve that for like one audience, but please, if you ever take away grid, flexbox, all that, I will be gone.
Yeah.
Not from, like, I don't know, like, to me, again, that's the differentiator. Like, that is what separates Webflow from Framer and all these other things that come out of the woodwork that are just some new abstraction, right? And that like, I really don't think HTML and CSS is going anywhere in terms of browsers anytime soon. And so like, yes, there's always these other ways to compile and morph around it, but like staying true to it, I really think is what will carry Webflow so much further. And even to what you said, Mason, earlier around like, I like that you like downplayed or diss that it was called quality of life features, because I couldn't agree more as well. Like that's how they're referred to, but like that's where I wish and hope Webflow will keep growing, is like all these things that just make the actual building and layout and all that stuff better and more powerful, not just like easier, but more powerful, right? So anyway.
They've kind of gotten distracted by these shiny objects, which aren't really going to do anything.
Yeah.
So membership isn't going to do anything to help Webflow go up market. Logic isn't going to help anything for Webflow to go up market. Translations is like a whole other big thing where there's whole companies that are built on this.
It's I don't know. When you compared it to e-commerce, that is definitely a real feeling. But I don't know. I do have high hopes that there's still potential. We'll say that, because like, especially even memberships, an example is like you compare it to like MemberStack or something that is all front end. Like Webflow, if doing it natively, has like a lot more control to make something like that like super feasible in terms of like server-side security, that kind of stuff. So I really hope those are the things that like, if we're going to do this, let's make sure we do it in a way that no one else externally can, as just a plugin or something like that.
So what I would say, so and this is like totally off topic, but my thing is dumbbells. So over here, make it really easy in terms of authoring, great quality of life improvements, and then over here, extensible. Because what doesn't have membership or translations built in is WordPress, or AEM, or like all these other big, massive platforms. And I just worry that it is diverting engineering and design talent into, and it's like, great, go and do it in like 10 or 15 years. Like, let someone else build it, and then let someone else build a business, and then like even acquire them. Like, let's go and create a mergers and acquisition strategy that really helps Webflow to scale. And then, like open up that API so that like we could hit on it or whatever. For translations, it's actually a bigger thing where you want to be able to go and set state as a dropdown for people to be able to go and like, you could set state for doing A/B testing. You could set state for how to go and have different languages in there. So now I'm just like pontificating around like my hopes and dreams for the product and like wanting to channel that through Corey.
That's what we do here. This is what we do here.
Like
so
I said,
I feel bad. I feel bad every time I see anyone that's like on the Webflow team, because they're like, oh fuck, they're just going to tell me all the things they're trying to get on this. Like,
no, I remember I have little to no weight, but I am on a team at Webflow that all we do all day is build stuff in Webflow for Webflow. So like, we definitely get involved in a lot of conversations as like SPs, even, like the main audience of Webflow is, freelancers and agencies. And like, I am grateful for the fact that like, I live that, I go home, put the kids asleep, and I freelance, so like, I don't just work there, but I like live what the main audience is. And so I 1000% empathize with everything you say. And like, yeah, even just, yeah, recently I voiced this again on quality of life stuff, just because I think the scary side as well is like the more major features we have, the more small amounts of like debt or small amounts of like UI debt, we'll say, or like
Yep.
UX debt, right? Like stuff that's like, oh, especially when I've been teaching new people Webflow, and there's like little quirky things that have become more and more and more because of all these other things that are coming in. Even components is a recent one, like has had some like weirdness here and there. And it's awkward. It's a super awkward situation where like I always am like, Webflow is super reliable. It's really scalable, powerful. Like, when I first found it, all we tried to do for 2 years at my last job was like break it. Like what you even said at the beginning is like, what are all the use cases we can throw at it, from a client perspective or client requirement, and see when it falls flat. And it never did because of the ability to integrate code or whatever. But like, I don't know. And it's just, yeah, I've been having more and more of those. But anyways.
You're saying it's falling flat more.
Yeah, like, don't get me wrong, it's still incredibly powerful. I think maybe the better way to put it is that like people that are learning it sometimes get distracted by these small, tiny little buggy things that are natural to happen as products scale this quickly. And then they miss the big, amazing things like how I just pulled in, a bunch of CSV, or just imported a CSV into a custom collection and then mapped it to a page and published within the matter of like 15 minutes, and how incredible that is. And then the fact that that's just the tip of the iceberg. Now I can do all of this stuff on top of that. And so I don't know. It's, again, I have steep faith, and I joke that I will be there for 30 years if Webflow will have me. So, I have every faith that it'll keep going. And obviously they said you've been here this long. So yeah,
yeah. And I mean, it's a platform that, a lot of people feel very passionate on because like they use it. And I think that, like this conversation, like the net of it is just, I think, to try to get, like, if there's one thing, it's like how to break out of our own bubbles, like start to identify like the bubble that you're in, and then say like, okay, how can I challenge this? How can I go and meet other people that are outside of this space? And then even as you were saying, like think more critically around some of the tools that we're inviting in or starting to look at, because yeah, like it's like the marketing layer is like this, then, and then you break down into it and there's not a lot of there.
So if we do this dumbbell approach, right, where you've got your authoring and you've got your development, and let's just make sure that these two pieces have a really strong connection between the two ends of the dumbbell, and then let's let all the other businesses slot in and fill out that dumbbell. Does it introduce a situation where now all of a sudden my tool I've got 6 different tools I'm using, and we were just talking about how we want to get rid of tools and we want to streamline tools.
I think it's a great counterpoint. And what I would say is that, yes, we could look at ways in which this has been done poorly, like the, WordPress plugins, or you could look at ways that it's been done really well, like the Apple App Store. And those are 2 ways in which Apple didn't, like Apple went for the dumbbell approach. They went for the extremes. And then they created an environment for people to go in and create lots of businesses on top of that. And Webflow is kind of playing around with that with their app store. It's not there, right? So there's just not enough. There's not enough bites. And also, anyone that's doing serious Webflow app dev right now, you're breaking terms of service. So like Wiz, all these every single product out there is breaking terms of service and can be shut down overnight.
Can you expand on that a little bit? What's the
Yeah.
kind of spooky?
Neil's like, oh crap.
Yeah, am I building something that's breaking?
Yeah. So basically,
What'd you take away from the meetup, Neil? My business is gonna
yeah. So I have like a series of blog posts that I want to do, but definitely one of them is like Webflow has a terms of service problem. And yeah, like you go and you read it, and like there's like basically code injections within the designer. So like all of these like Chrome extensions that everyone's talking about, like all of those break the terms of service. Wiz breaks the terms of service because that's technically scraping. Like if you wanted to get into it. Wes, a product that we've built, we actually haven't publicized it or talked about it because we've wanted to be very careful around terms of service, and we've only sold that to enterprise customers. And what we're doing now is we're saying that if you want to use this, you actually, as an enterprise customer, you're going to have an MSA. Now you can go in and like, you can get whatever terms you want within that MSA. It's a negotiated contract directly with Webflow. So that's how we're selling that only on the enterprise side. But yeah, like I have asked, for example, last 2 weeks ago, there was a series of announcements from a company, and they were talking about doing server-side code injections into Webflow and all this stuff, and like how to be able to have components that went. Same thing for what who is it? Reloom is doing with their ability to copy components and do it. Like all of that stuff breaks terms of service. It could be shut down overnight.
What if it's all 100% client side? Like just
doesn't matter. Like we have some stuff that we're doing with even if you, and again, it's debatable, right? So it's like you could go and say, what's a server-side rendering and what's a scrape, right? So that's one of the things you could look at. And it's like, well, you can go and debate that while you have no access to the platform and you potentially lose access to every single thing that you've ever built in Webflow.
I see, but you just said server side. If it's all client side,
so if you have code that you're using, like letter run doesn't break terms of service. Now, if I was to go in and do that through a Chrome extension into the designer, now I'm breaking terms of service.
Okay, I see.
But I also, the code that's getting created, and now we're just like, it's 1036. We can't go into this terms of service topic. But but for example, like let's say you go and create something, and then you want to go and within your own build render that onto someplace else. Webflow could argue potentially that that's breaking terms of service. Or like
because you're rendering in Webflow and then taking it out. Like if you build something in Webflow, it's got to be in Webflow.
It's just, how about this? We're not going to get it. I won't go too far down this rabbit hole, but all I'm saying is like the app market. So for Neil, for Kyle, what you were talking about is like going and creating all this stuff between the two dumbbells. So like whatever there's like the flow like even what is the what all the translation solutions out there, they all break terms of service. Like you want to go in and just look at it, like what they do and then what the terms of service are today. All translation products for Webflow break terms of service. And that's where it's like like there's just not a cohesive strategy right now on like what app dev means for Webflow.
So to put maybe Neil, and not that this is to,
I would say just keep building, because
I was gonna say like what's the takeaway here?
How
for
about this?
Neil?
Like
Stop.
Whoever it was, the translation product that was at the Webflow conference.
Weglot.
Yeah, like they're massive sponsors. Like I think overall there's a lot of goodwill. It's just that, as someone I'm married to a lawyer, and so she's always like, what are you building? And she's like digging into stuff that there's inherent risk there that hasn't been resolved.
I see. But just to set everybody at ease, our platform's just a little piece of JavaScript. That's all it is.
There you go. That's all hey, I'm just going to say
it's scraped. It's just a piece of JavaScript. It scrapes, it injects, it does,
Yeah, and I just launched a site a month ago called Carrot that does exactly all this stuff, and I'm going to have to talk to them. I just put the link in if you want to take a look at it, but it's got a bunch of React running, and they've got apps on the Android and iOS store, but it's taking feeds from that database that those apps are pulling from and then injecting it back into Webflow. And then, it's.
So you can do some of that through like the API and going into the collections. And I think that's all fine. It's just, this is like a whole other topic that we won't be able to go into, but I would say, Corey, you posted terms of service. That's all really good. It's mostly the big offenders are really anything that's happening through an extension or anything that's like once you're rendering from Webflow and then you're sitting on top of Webflow.
And actually like manipulating, like a lot of those Chrome extensions are just running code on top of the designer, right? As if you like pop the console open, you're just gonna like dump some script in there. And yeah, so like it's pretty obvious in any app world. Like isn't that like the baby steps into hacking basically, right? So that's like it, but yeah, I think that's mainly what you're getting at, right, Mason? Like versus like external things and whatnot. And yeah.
But even the external ones, like the way that Wiz works, technically, because it's like referencing, even though it's just taking that build and then sitting on top of it, that sitting on top as another layer breaks terms of service. But we have gone over, but I would love to have another conversation around this whenever anyone wants to invite me back. I've loved the conversation here, and I love just like, being able to go back and forth, and it's been super fun. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is great. A round of applause to Mason for sharing his knowledge. Round of applause.
I don't know about applause. You guys just let me pontificate for a little while. So Rachel, I hope my hot takes were okay or made enough sense or defendable.
Absolutely.
Obviously, just like pick your own path, right? And so for us, it's like we're not going to be doing. We're going into more like lots of Webflow and then lots of code, but going and doing like, Neil, I love what you showed with like that one little example, I would say, but even getting into that, it takes some kind of programming background as opposed to just like, there's no like, Corey, for what you were talking about with like all these tools. And then we can just think like, oh, there's a magic carpet ride that's just going to get me there. And there's like, unfortunately, not any magic carpets.
Yeah.
I'm going to rename the event Mason Poe's Hot Takes.
All right.
Hot take.
Cool.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, good to see everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Mason.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mason.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mason.
Neil?
Thanks.